The unexpected inheritance, the sting of truth. The day the lion failed attention. If you thought success was all that mattered, this story is about to deliver a brutal reality check. Before diving into this mogul's drama and redemption, hit the like button. If this twist of fate impacts you, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for more exclusive content. Boston, Massachusetts night. Jonathan the Lion. Sterling had spent decades building his empire, surrounding himself with power, wealth, and absolute control over every aspect of his life. His existence was a mathematical structure, every decision coldly calculated. Nothing could ever truly surprise him, until the night his doorbell rang. When he opened the wrought iron gates of his New England manor, Jonathan expected a business partner, a security alert, perhaps a bold journalist. Instead, he found Sophie Bellwether, the woman he had pushed away years ago, dismissing her with a cold check and a silent goodbye. And in her arms, clutching a small toy truck, with striking blue eyes that mirrored his own with astonishing intensity, was a 6-year-old boy. "We need to talk," Sophie stated. And just like that, Jonathan's perfectly ordered world crumbled forever. The fall of the fortress of control. Jonathan Sterling was alone in his stately residence just outside Boston. The silence in the massive stone and marble house, a symbol of his power, pressed down on him like an invisible weight. He had dedicated his life to building perfection. His company was a leader in advanced robotics. His fortune was unmatched. People respected, feared, and envied him. But no one knew him. He preferred it that way. He poured himself a glass of aged scotch. The quiet should have been comforting, the reward for his hard work. But tonight, something felt wrong. The doorbell rang. Jonathan frowned. No one arrived at his home without being announced by security. He set down the glass and walked to the door. As he opened it, his breath caught for the first time in years. There stood Sophie Bellwether, the woman he had loved, the woman he had driven away when his ambition demanded his absolute focus. Her dark brown hair was tousled by the breeze, her almond eyes held something unreadable. But it wasn't just her presence that shocked him. In her arms was a small boy, no older than 6. Jonathan's penetrating blue eyes immediately zeroed in on the child. Thick, dark hair, slightly messy. But those eyes, those striking blue eyes, they were his. His heart pounded furiously, yet his face remained impassive, a skill he had mastered in the boardroom. Sophie stood firm. "We need to talk." Jonathan let her in, his mind a whirlwind. Years of negotiations had trained him to mask emotions, but this was different. Sophie entered cautiously, gripping the hand of the boy, who stared in awe at everything. The soaring ceilings, the Carrara marble floors, the grand staircase. Jonathan closed the door. "Explain," he said, his voice firm but restrained. Sophie inhaled deeply, glancing at the boy before meeting Jonathan's gaze. "His name is Ethan, and he is your son." The words were a physical blow to his chest. Jonathan's control wavered. His gaze snapped to the boy, who was now staring at him with those unmistakable eyes. He felt the air thin around him. "You're lying," he said, though a cold certainty told him it was the truth. Sophie lifted her chin, her expression unbreakable. "I wouldn't be here if I were." Jonathan ran a hand through his dark hair, exhaling sharply. "Then why now?" Sophie hesitated, looking down at Ethan, choosing her words with extreme care. "Because I don't have much time left, Jonathan," she finally admitted. Jonathan narrowed his eyes. "What are you talking about?" She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around Ethan's. "I have cancer. It's aggressive. The doctors give me months, maybe less." For the first time in years, Jonathan felt truly disarmed. He had expected anything. A debt, a desperate plea for money, even revenge. But this? And what do you expect from me? He asked, forcing himself to focus. Sophie straightened, meeting his eyes. I need you to accept him. I need you to raise him. He has no one else. My sister refused. My parents are gone. When I leave, he will be alone. Jonathan shook his head, 1,000 arguments forming in his mind. I don't know how to be a father. Sophie let out a breath, a bitter smile crossing her lips. Neither did I, but I learned. And so will you. The silent question. Are you still too busy? The silence stretched. Jonathan looked at Ethan, the boy who hadn't spoken a word, clinging to his toy truck. Does he know? Jonathan asked softly. Sophie hesitated. No. He knows his father was important, but I never told him it was you. I wasn't sure if you'd want him, and I didn't want him to grow up feeling like a burden. Something tightened in Jonathan's chest. He had spent years building a life where emotions were a liability. Ethan, Sophie said, gently kneeling down. Sweetheart, remember we talked about your dad? Ethan nodded, his small fingers gripping the truck. Sophie looked up at Jonathan. She was scared, not of him, but of the finality of this moment. She turned back to Ethan and took a deep breath. He is. This is your daddy. Ethan's wide blue eyes widened slightly as he looked at Jonathan, this time with a new understanding. He didn't speak. He just stared. Are you mad? Ethan finally asked, a barely audible whisper. Jonathan exhaled, forcing himself to cut through the storm in his mind. He knelt, lowering his imposing figure to the child's level. No, Jonathan said, his voice softer than before. I am not mad. Mommy said you were very busy, Ethan said, still watching him. I was, Jonathan said, swallowing the lump in his throat. Are you still too busy? The question hit him harder than any corporate defeat. He couldn't answer immediately. Sophie watched him intently, waiting. Jonathan saw Ethan's small, nervous figure and knew there was only one possible response. Not anymore, he said. Ethan's grip on his toy truck loosened. There was a flicker of hope in his eyes. Sophie let out a relieved sigh. Jonathan knew it was only the beginning. He didn't know how to be a father. But looking at Ethan, the son he never knew he had, he realized that, for the first time in his life, he was about to take on something bigger than any business, bigger than any empire. And there was no turning back. If you were Jonathan, how would you handle the shock? What would you prioritize first for Sophie? And what would you do first for your son? Comment your strategy. 2. The truth in the night. The emptiness of success. Jonathan assigned Sophie and Ethan to a guest suite. He poured himself another glass of scotch. The alcohol burned his throat, but it didn't clear his mind. His thoughts returned to Sophie. Her look when she told him she was sick. The fact that Ethan had no one else. His son. A soft sound drew him from his thoughts. Ethan was standing a few feet away, his teddy bear clutched in one hand. Barefoot. Can't sleep? Jonathan asked. Ethan shook his head. No. Do you live here alone? Ethan asked. Jonathan nodded. I do. Ethan frowned. It's really big. Jonathan smiled bitterly. It's supposed to be. It feels empty, Ethan said. That simple statement wounded Jonathan more than any betrayal. Ethan hesitated before asking, his voice soft and wavering. Did you want me? The question stole his breath. He knelt to the boy's level. I didn't know about you, he admitted honestly. If I had known, things would have been different. Mommy said you were important, Ethan said. Too important for things like this. I was wrong, Jonathan finally said. There are more important things. Ethan looked him in the eyes and nodded, as if accepting that answer. Can I stay out here? He asked. You don't have to ask, Jonathan said. This is your home now. Ethan nodded and walked back to bed. Jonathan watched him go. For the first time in years, his mansion didn't feel quite so empty. And for the first time in his life, Jonathan Sterling knew that no amount of power or wealth compared to what he had just received. the chance to be a father. 3. Pancakes and the first step of vulnerability. The next morning, Jonathan found himself in the kitchen, staring at a cup of cold coffee. For the first time, he didn't call his staff. He knew nothing about children, but he knew he couldn't ignore Ethan. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his hair messy, his blue eyes still sleepy, clutching his toy truck. "Good morning," Jonathan said, surprised at how different his voice sounded. Softer, less controlled. "Morning," Ethan said. "Are you hungry?" Jonathan asked. Ethan nodded. "Mommy used to make pancakes." Jonathan frowned. He had never cooked. But how hard could it be? He found a box of mix and read the instructions. "Do you know how to cook?" Ethan asked, sitting on the stool, watching him. "Not really, but I know how to follow instructions." "Mommy never used instructions," Ethan said. "She just knew." "It seems your mother was good at many things," Jonathan said, cracking an egg. When the first pancake sputtered on the pan, Ethan leaned forward, clearly invested in the process. "You're not very good at flipping," he observed after Jonathan botched the first attempt. "I'm better at running companies than making pancakes." Ethan smiled, and for the first time, Jonathan saw a hint of relaxation on his face. A few minutes later, Jonathan placed a plate of slightly uneven pancakes in front of the boy. "Tell me if they're edible." Ethan took a bite. "They're not as good as Mommy's." He paused, taking another bite. "But they're not bad." Jonathan took it as a victory. They ate in silence, but this time it was a comfortable silence. Something was beginning to form between them. "Are you really going to take care of me?" Ethan asked when he finished. Jonathan swallowed. "Yes." "Even when it gets hard?" Jonathan exhaled. "Even then." Ethan nodded. "Okay." That one word felt more important than any contract he had ever signed. He had just made the biggest commitment of his life. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. Before, the slow march towards fatherhood, the transition was not easy. Jonathan was a man of strict schedules, but now every morning began with the sound of small feet padding down the hall, or an unexpected question. Ethan was observant, cautious, as if still unsure if this new life was real or temporary. The first true challenge came one night. Jonathan was in his office when he heard a soft creak. He saw Ethan standing by his door, gripping a teddy bear Jonathan hadn't noticed before. "Ethan, I had a bad dream," the boy said. Faltering, Jonathan's instinct was to tell him to go back to bed. But something in the way the boy stood there, his blue eyes uncertain, stopped him. "Do you want to talk about it?" Jonathan asked. Ethan shook his head. "No." "Do you want to go back to bed?" Ethan looked at his feet. "I want to stay here for a bit." Jonathan invited him onto the sofa. Ethan curled up with his bear. Jonathan sat in the armchair opposite, unsure what to do. He didn't know how to comfort a child, so he simply sat there. Minutes passed in silence. Finally, Ethan's breathing became even. Jonathan watched him. Maybe he didn't have to know everything right away. Perhaps for now, just being there was enough. The big day. A promise of presence. One morning, Jonathan was having coffee when Ethan asked, "I have to go to school, right?" "Yes," Jonathan said. "I went to a small school before. I liked it. Will you take me?" Jonathan felt the weight of that simple request. "Yes," Jonathan said firmly. "I will take you." Days later, the morning of Ethan's first day of school arrived. The boy was unusually quiet, his toy truck untouched next to his cereal bowl. "Nervous?" Jonathan asked. "A little. Time to go. We don't want to be late." Halfway there, Ethan finally spoke. "You won't forget to pick me up, will you?" "Of course not." Jonathan gripped the steering wheel. "I promise I will be there," he said firmly. "On time, Ethan. On time." When they arrived, Jonathan knelt beside him. "You'll do great. And I'll be right here when school is over." Ethan hesitated. Then, to Jonathan's surprise, he wrapped his arms around his neck in a quick, fierce hug. Jonathan froze, then carefully returned the embrace. Ethan pulled back. "Okay, see you later." Jonathan watched him walk into the school, his small toy truck still in his hand. For the first time in his life, Jonathan Sterling understood what it meant to be responsible for someone else. Not just financially or legally, but emotionally. And as he stood there, watching his son walk into his future, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going anywhere. The grand truth. The strength of the encounter. This story is more than a simple account of a businessman discovering his son. It is a journey of unexpected redemption and the realization that true success is not measured in power or wealth, but in the connections we build. Jonathan Sterling, the Lion, began as a man who believed he had good everything, until he was confronted with the one thing he never planned: fatherhood. At first, he resisted because he didn't know how. He had spent years avoiding attachment, believing it was a weakness. But as he got to know Ethan, he realized that love is not a distraction. It is the only thing that truly matters. Ethan, on the other hand, is a child thrown into a life with a man he never knew. He is cautious, yet despite everything, open to the possibility of trust. His quiet strength is what ultimately changes Jonathan. The beauty of this story lies in its imperfect journey. Jonathan doesn't become a perfect father overnight. Ethan doesn't immediately embrace him. There are moments of doubt and struggle, but in the end, they choose each other. By watching his son walk into school, Jonathan solidified his transformation. He had spent his life believing he was in control of everything, only to realize that the most important decision he made was one he never saw coming. This is a story about how love, even when unexpected, has the power to reshape a life. And in the end, Jonathan not only gains a son, he gains a reason to truly live. Don't forget that Jonathan and Ethan's life has just begun. What do you think Jonathan should do to support Sophie in her final months? Hit like if you believe in this second chance, and subscribe for more stories of redemption. The unyielding truth: time is the ultimate liability. The cruel reality: the time running out. Subscribe now and share your thoughts. How can Jonathan, a man who values control, cope with the uncontrollable reality of loss? Hit like if you are rooting for him. Jonathan Sterling's commitment to being on time for Ethan's school pickup wasn't just a simple promise. It was the anchor he needed to maintain his composure, while life inside his mansion grew increasingly unstable. Sophie Bellwether was weakening. The months the doctors had given her felt like weeks. Jonathan took charge, arranging the best private medical care in Boston, transforming one of the suites into a comfortable, serene hospice space. But even the boundless wealth of the Lion could not buy time. Control, that virtue which had always defined Jonathan, vanished in the presence of illness. He could not negotiate with cancer, nor could he buy his way to victory. He could only be present. Sophie watched him, not with gratitude, but with reserved curiosity. She knew Jonathan was doing all this for Ethan, but she also saw how his constant presence was beginning to change the man she had once known. She saw him struggle awkwardly to prepare dinner, sit up late with Ethan when he couldn't sleep, and manage frustration with a patience he never knew he possessed. One afternoon, Jonathan walked into the suite. Sophie was reading a story to Ethan, her voice lower and rougher than before. When she saw Jonathan, she gestured for him to approach after Ethan left the room. "We need to discuss the details," she said. Jonathan sat by the bedside, feeling a pang of pain seeing her fragility. "I've spoken with my lawyers. Everything is in order. I've established a trust for Ethan that will protect him for the rest of his life. Legally, you don't have to worry about anything," Jonathan said, slipping back into his business mode. Sophie smiled sadly. "I was never worried about the money. I was worried about the man who would hold it. They looked at each other in silence. For the first time in the conversation, Jonathan looked away. "I'm trying, Sophie," he said, his voice almost a plea. "I don't know how to do this. How do I explain to a 6-year-old that his mother is leaving?" Sophie took his hand, a gesture that surprised both of them. It was the first time she had touched him since that fateful night. "You don't explain it. You show it. He needs love, not answers. And he needs you, not as a banker, but as a safe harbor. You asked why I didn't tell you sooner. I didn't want this to force you to love him. I wanted you to do it by choice." Jonathan squeezed her hand, his expression a mixture of guilt and agony. "You left because I made you feel like you had to. I left because I loved you. And I knew that your ambition, at that time, would have destroyed everything we were. I protected our son from you, Jonathan. And now I am doing the only thing left, protecting him from my absence, leaving him with the only man who has my eyes, and whom I know, deep down, I can trust to stay." Sophie's words, both harsh and loving, resonated through the room. He didn't deserve her faith, but she was giving it to him anyway. Sophie has placed her final trust in Jonathan. Do you believe the love they still share can heal the wounds of the past before it's too late? Comment your opinion. Ethan's lesson. Building a bridge. The house, once a fortress of silence, now filled with a constant quiet noise. Building blocks and crayon drawings mingled with Jonathan's business folders. Ethan, despite the underlying tension, adapted with astonishing maturity. He understood that Mommy was very, very tired and needed lots of quiet and lots of hugs. And he understood that Daddy, though clumsy with pancakes and hide and seek, was always there. The healing for Jonathan and Sophie came through Ethan. One afternoon, Jonathan found Sophie struggling to assemble a complex construction toy Ethan had left. She was frustrated, her weak hands refusing to cooperate. Jonathan sat down without a word and began to help. It wasn't engineering, but it required patience. "You were always good with structures," Sophie said with a strained smile. "Only if they were made of steel and money, not plastic and emotions," he replied. As they worked, they didn't talk about business or illness. They talked about Ethan. His obsession with rockets, his fear of the dark, and the way his smile could change the mood of the room. "You have to teach him how to shave," Sophie said softly. "And you have to teach him not to be afraid to cry. You never did." "I don't want him to be a weak man," Jonathan said, almost instinctively. Sophie looked at him pointedly. "Weakness isn't in tears, Jonathan. It's in the fear of loving. You've shown him you can stay, now show him you can feel." Ethan returned just then, his blue eyes bright. He saw the sight of his father and mother sitting together, connecting the last pieces of the toy he had abandoned. "Did you finish it?" he asked. "We finished it," Jonathan said. Ethan hugged the toy, unaware that what had truly been finished was not a plastic castle, but a bridge between his parents. Fate, the farewell that never arrives, and the promise that endures. The final days were a blur of love and sorrow. Jonathan never left the room. He was the one who called the lawyers, who spoke to the doctors, and who also held her hand when Sophie asked him to quietly read her a passage from a worn copy of Leaves of Grass that she loved. Sophie passed away one crisp autumn morning as a gentle rain fell over Boston. Ethan was asleep in the next room. Jonathan stayed with her until the end. There was no panic, no negotiation, just a deep, sad peace. Before leaving, Sophie looked at him one last time. "Take care of our son, and take care of yourself. You are not alone anymore." And she was gone. Jonathan spent the morning alone, with his grief, in the now empty suite. In the afternoon, Ethan woke up. Jonathan knelt down, hugged him tightly, and explained, his voice firm, but with brutal honesty, that Mommy had gone to the stars. But she was everywhere now, Ethan cried. And for the first time in his life, Jonathan cried with him, not out of fear of loss, but out of shared pain. Two pairs of blue eyes, flooded by the same sadness, united by the love for the same woman. Jonathan did not collapse. He became the rock Sophie had asked him to be. The funeral was simple and private. Ethan, holding his father's hand, threw a flower, and then snuggled into Jonathan's jacket. Pause for thought. Jonathan has passed Sophie's ultimate test. What new emotional challenge do you think awaits Jonathan as he raises Ethan without his mother's guidance? Comment your thoughts. Ike's, the true legacy. The man who stayed. The months that followed were a silent restructuring of life and soul. Jonathan distanced himself from the daily operations of his empire. He installed a new home office, shifting his focus from market control to fatherhood control. He learned about sleep schedules, dental appointments, and parent-teacher meetings. His staff was astonished. The man who once demanded reports on glossy paper now asked for help finding his son's sneakers. One day, Ethan came home from school with a drawing. It was a portrait of the three of them. Him with messy hair. Sophie with a radiant smile and angel wings. And Jonathan in a business suit, but with a large red heart painted on his chest. The teacher asked us what was most important, Ethan said, offering him the drawing. And what did you draw? Jonathan asked. My family. And you, Daddy. Because you are very strong. And you stayed. Jonathan took the drawing. In a world where he had measured success by billions and influence, that simple crayon drawing became his most valuable possession. He framed it and placed it on his desk, next to his trading screens. He had gone from being the mogul who had everything to being the father who was everything to his son. His heart, which had been armored for decades, was now open and vulnerable, filled with a love that gave him a purpose his old empire could never match. Jonathan Sterling, the lion, had found his true strength not in conquering the world, but in remaining at home, proving to his son that love, even when unexpected, is always the most valuable legacy. This is the end of the second chapter of Jonathan's life. Loss has brought union, and the future presents itself as a new adventure for two men, united by a love that arose from tragedy. If this story moved you, subscribe and stay tuned for the next chapter where Jonathan faces new life and love. The lion's new roar, the structure of happiness, the year of transition, consolidating presence. Subscribe to witness the lion's next chapter. Hit like if you think Jonathan deserves a chance at new love. What kind of partner do you envision for the reformed mogul? The first year without Sophie was a quiet journey, marked more by the newfound routines than by the ache of absence. Jonathan Sterling didn't just reorganize his business calendar. He entirely reorganized his life around his son. He sold the enormous, sterile Boston mansion, a symbol of his old isolation, and bought a warmer, more manageable estate closer to the bustling suburbs, complete with a sprawling yard and a small pond. Jonathan, the man who feared no global financial crisis, discovered he was terrified of Ethan's occasional nightmares. He learned to trust the school caretakers, patiently listen to teacher reports, and grasp that a 7-year-old needed time and presence, not just provision. His staff was stunned. The man who once demanded sharp reports now humbly asked for help finding his son's favorite soccer cleats. A subtle yet profound change occurred in his professional life. Jonathan began investing heavily in robotics and sustainable energy projects aimed at improving community life, driven not only by profitability, but by the vision of a safer, cleaner future for Ethan's generation. His money now had a purpose, an emotional resonance. 11. The search for balance. The emotional gap. As Ethan turned 7, he grew more inquisitive. His questions were no longer solely about his mother's absence, but about his father's life before them. Dad, "Why don't you have friends?" he asked one day, while Jonathan was working in the garden, attacking weeds with the same intensity he once used to buy a company. Jonathan paused. "What do you mean? I have partners, investors." "No, friends. Someone who comes over and laughs with you. Mommy had Aunt Carol. Who do you have?" Jonathan realized his social life consisted solely of business dinners and video calls. He had avoided emotional connection for so long that the idea of genuine friendship seemed both absurd and dangerous. He had isolated himself by choice. I have you," Jonathan replied. Ethan smiled, but then turned serious. "That doesn't count. You have to have someone else." His son's statement struck him hard. Jonathan had become the perfect caregiver, the impeccable provider, but he remained a solitary man. Ethan didn't just need a present father. He needed a model for a complete life, one that included joy, connection, and social vulnerability. 12. The chance encounter. The new beginning. The shift came through necessity. Ethan was invited to the birthday party of a classmate, Aiden, at a local park. Jonathan, still wearing his tailored suit, felt utterly out of place among the casually dressed parents. While watching Ethan, Jonathan noticed a woman near the picnic table. It was Clara Reyes, Aiden's mother. Clara was a landscape architect, with curly hair pulled back and an easy, warm smile. She wore no makeup, but her presence was inviting and radiant. She approached him cautiously. "Mr. Sterling, right? Ethan and Aiden are inseparable." "Yes, Jonathan. Please," he said, uncomfortable with the familiarity. "I'm Clara. Aiden told me all about your pancake prowess," she said, laughing softly. Jonathan, for the first time, felt a pang of embarrassment about his domestic clumsiness, but also a slight relief this was a topic that had nothing to do with trading or acquisitions. They began talking about school, the weather, and the challenges of single parenting. Clara didn't look at him as the lion of business, but as another parent grappling with crayon drawings and unexpected illnesses. He discovered she had also lost her husband a few years prior, raising Aiden alone. There was a silent connection in their shared pain and determination. "You look lonely," Clara stated bluntly. "You have a wonderful boy. Don't raise him in isolation." Clara's words, so direct and kind, echoed Ethan's challenge. Jonathan realized that if he wanted to teach his son the value of human connection, he had to model it himself. He accepted Clara's invitation for coffee one day, not as a date, but as a simple social interaction. Call to action. Do you think Jonathan, after tragedy, is ready to open his heart to a new friendship, or perhaps something more, with Clara? Comment if this is the right direction for the lion. 13. The gift of vulnerability. A walk through the common. The coffee turned into a walk with the boys in Boston Common, and then into simple weeknight dinners. Jonathan and Clara were opposites, yet they shared the same fierce faith in their children's future. One weekend, Jonathan took Ethan and Clara's son, Alan Aiden, to the Museum of Science. While waiting for the boys to finish a display, Jonathan, with a candor that felt completely alien to him, told Clara the story of Sophie. Not the business version, but the truth, the cowardice, the flight, the guilt, and the undeserved faith Sophie had bestowed upon him at the end. Clara listened silently. When he finished, she simply took his hand. "Your story isn't one of cowardice, Jonathan," she said. "It's about a man who had the courage to change when he didn't have to. Sophie didn't just forgive you. She gave you a second chance to love your son and yourself. That is a gift." Jonathan nodded. He realized that talking about his pain, instead of burying it under control, didn't make him weak. It made him human. It made him a better father. As evening fell, Jonathan watched Ethan and Aiden fast asleep in the back of the car. Ethan was no longer just his son. He was his teacher, the catalyst for his own humanity. The lion had stopped roaring alone. He had learned to share his silence and his sorrow, and in the process, he had begun to build, brick by brick, not an empire, but a home, anchored in presence and the promise of a future where love would always take priority. Chapter 14. Spring in New England. 4 hearts connected. 2 years after Ethan's arrival, the small estate outside Boston was thriving. The garden, now thoughtfully designed by Clara, had become their sanctuary. Jonathan had become an integral part not only of Ethan's life, but also of Clara's and her son Aiden's. There were no grand declarations, just gentle routines. Friday dinners had become a ritual. Jonathan cooked imperfect grilled food. Clara brought a homemade salad, and the 2 boys, Ethan and Aiden, built forts under blankets. Clara was not a replacement for Sophie, but a new source of light, bringing a warmth and serenity that Jonathan had lacked for so long. The relationship built cautiously, one step at a time. They talked about their losses, their ambitions, and the complexity of raising children alone. When Clara rested her head on his shoulder after the boys were asleep, it wasn't out of romantic passion, but a profound comfort, a recognition that they had both found an unexpected anchor. Ethan and Aiden became inseparable, a complementary duo. Ethan, the quiet and intelligent. Aiden, the vivacious and funny. Aiden's presence had helped Ethan open up and experience the carefree joy that Jonathan, on his own, struggled to generate. 60. The ultimate promise. The family compact. It was time to formalize the life they already lived. Jonathan didn't plan an extravagant dinner or a public gesture. He wanted it to be simple, sincere, and centered on the foundation of his new life. Family. One Friday afternoon, instead of preparing the grill, Jonathan gathered Ethan, Aiden, and Clara in the living room. "I have something important to say," Jonathan began, his voice slightly nervous, a feeling he hadn't experienced in any boardroom. He knelt, not with the ring yet, but at the boys' level, looking at them first. "When Ethan's mommy went to the stars, she asked me to take care of you. I have. And in this time, this house is filled up with laughter, with pancakes, and with love I didn't know was possible. Ethan, Aiden, you are the reason I am a happy man." Then, he took out 2 small boxes, one for Ethan and one for Aiden. Inside each was an identical wristwatch, engraved with a small rocket ship. These watches remind us that our team is together, that we always have to look out for each other. The boys gasped. Him. Then, Jonathan stood, turned to Clara, and pulled out the 3rd box. It wasn't silver, but carved olive wood, filled with the memory of their beginnings inside. It was a simple platinum band. "Clara Reyes," he said, taking her hands. "My first promise was only about presence. My second, in the hospital, was about permanence. Today, my 3rd promise is that I want to make this team a family forever. You taught me to be human. You brought me peace. You gave me a second chance to love, and you allowed me to be a complete father. Will you make the home we've already built official and marry me?" Clara's eyes were moist, but her smile was radiant. "Jonathan Sterling, you risked everything to stay. Of course I will." The embrace was interrupted by the cheers of Ethan and Aiden, who, understanding the magnitude of the moment, jumped onto them, celebrating the union of the pancake family. 7th Epilogue, The Unmeasurable Legacy. A year later, the wedding took place in their New England garden, a place now full of life and laughter. Ethan and Aiden served as ring bearers, carrying Carla's band and Jonathan's simple platinum ring, which was engraved with the coordinates of their new home. Jonathan, standing with his new wife and sons, looked at the thriving garden. He had gone from a man of success to a man of value. He had lost the woman who gave him a son, but he gained the family who taught him to love him. The small blue toy truck, the relic of his redemption, now sat on his desk, on a pedestal of honor. Jonathan's legacy resided not in the glass towers of Boston, but in the simple fact that he had knelt before his son and his new partner. He had learned that the true measure of a man is not how high he can climb alone, but how solid the home he chooses to build with others truly is. This is a complete story about how presence, redemption, and unexpected love triumph over power and isolation. If the ending of this saga moved you, hit like and share this story with your friends. Subscribe to the channel to discover how the Sterling Reyes family faces the next chapter of their lives. Tuyet voi. Toi rud vui, vi banda dong han kung câu chuyện của Jonathan và Ethan cho đến tận giây phút cuối cùng. The Lion's New Roar. The Test of the External World's 7. The Structure of Happiness. Post-Epilogue. Subscribe now. Hit the like button if you believe the lion is ready to protect his new family from the outside world. The wedding of Jonathan Sterling and Clara Reyes wasn't the end of the story. It was merely the grand launch of their new life structure. The Pancake family, Jonathan, Clara, Ethan, now 9, and Aiden, now 8, settled into a rhythm dictated by school events, soccer games, and the joyful chaos of shared parenting. Jonathan's transformation was evident in his work. He had shifted the culture of Nexus dynamics from ruthless pursuit to conscious innovation. His greatest success wasn't measured by stock price, but by the fact that he consistently left the office at 5 p.m. His new business mantra was simple. If it can't be solved by the morning, it's not a crisis. It's a lack of planning. Ethan, inheriting his father's intellect, but tempered by his mother's warmth, was thriving. He no longer carried the weight of his mother's absence. He carried the joy of his father's presence and the stability of his new family. Aiden, ever the comedian, ensured the house was never silent. 18. The vulture at the gate. The grandmother's return. The tranquility was shattered 8 months into their marriage by a figure from Jonathan's past, Eleanor Sterling, his mother. Eleanor, a woman who embodied the cold, aristocratic wealth of old money Boston, had been absent from Jonathan's life for decades, disapproving of his emotional distance from the family lineage and his choice of career. When Sophie arrived, Eleanor demanded he place the child in a boarding school, stating, "He is an inconvenience to your position, Jonathan." Jonathan, in one of his first acts of true independence, cut off contact with her completely. Eleanor arrived unannounced at their door, not to congratulate them, but to issue a demand. "Jonathan," she stated, surveying Clara with a frosty gaze, "this domestic charade is embarrassing. You are neglecting your professional duty. But more importantly, Ethan Sterling is now 8. He belongs in St. Paul's Preparatory in New Hampshire, where he will be groomed for the Vance Family Trust, not running around with the son of a landscape architect." Jonathan felt a flash of the old heat, the inherited anger that had once driven him to abandon those he loved. But this time, the anger was protective, not destructive. "Ethan is happy, Mother," Jonathan replied, his voice calm and firm. "His home is here. His school is here. His family is here." "Family," Eleanor scoffed. "A messy collection of half-siblings and a stepmother is not a family, Jonathan. It is a distraction. I am invoking my right as the only living grandparent to petition for legal guardianship. The Sterling name demands lineage, not pancakes." The threat was real. Eleanor had the legal team, the influence, and the sheer audacity to drag them into a painful public court battle. Her intent wasn't to raise Ethan. It was to control Jonathan by seizing his most valuable asset. Pause for thought. Eleanor is using the Sterling name and legal power to pressure Jonathan. How should Jonathan fight this legal battle while protecting Ethan and maintaining his balance? Comment your strategy. The lion fights for home. Jonathan did not panic. The old lion would have fought with financial brute force. The new Jonathan fought with strategy, transparency, and the strength of his presence. Transparency with the boys. Jonathan sat down with Ethan and Aiden. He explained the situation clearly, assuring Ethan, "No one can take you from this house, son. Not even Grandma. We are your family." This open communication prevented fear from festering. Clara's strategy. Clara, always the structural expert, helped Jonathan organize his defense based on proof of presence. They compiled years of photos, school reports signed by Jonathan, doctor's visits, and testimony from neighbors and teachers. The defense was simple. The children's best interest lay with the stable, loving unit they had built. The nexus dynamics. Defense. Jonathan used his company's resources not for aggression, but for validation. He submitted his updated employment contract, showing that he had intentionally restructured his role, accepting a lower travel schedule and salary cap to prioritize his family. He showed the court that his life balance was a non-negotiable term of his employment. The custody hearing was agonizing. Eleanor's lawyer painted Jonathan as an inconsistent father who had bought his way into fatherhood after years of neglect. Then, Clara took the stand. She didn't speak of love or romance. She spoke of consistency. "I watched Jonathan Sterling choose to stay when every ounce of his ambition told him to leave," Clara testified, her voice clear. "He didn't just write a check, he wrote a new life. He knows every scrape, every school project, and every pancake disaster. He is not just Ethan's provider, he is his anchor. And I challenge anyone to separate a child from his anchor." The judge, clearly moved by the evidence of their stable, integrated life, dismissed Eleanor's petition with prejudice. Chiekska, the true measure of the lion. Ricardo did not celebrate with a grand party. He celebrated by arriving home early. As he walked in, Ethan and Aiden, already aware of the victory from Clara's celebratory call, rushed him. "We won, Dad!" Aiden shouted. "Grandma can't take me?" Ethan asked, still needing the final confirmation. Jonathan knelt, pulling both boys into a tight hug. "No, son, no one can ever take you, because this home is stronger than any court order." Later that evening, after the boys were asleep, Jonathan stood with Clara on the porch, looking out at the yard. "Thank you, Clara," he whispered, holding her close. "You saved him. You saved us." "You saved yourself, Jonathan," she corrected gently. "I just helped you document it. You learned that true control isn't about manipulating the outside world. It's about mastering the choices you make inside your own home." Jonathan looked at his house, warm and illuminated. He had faced down a hostile takeover, the death of a loved one, and the manipulative power of his own family name. He had won every battle because of one simple defining choice: presence. The lion, having defended his den and his mate, finally found an unshakable peace. His greatest legacy wasn't the billions in his trust, but the two small, happy boys sleeping peacefully inside, secure in the knowledge that their father would never, ever leave. What a journey. Jonathan protected his family against all odds. If this final act of redemption inspires you, please like and share this story. Comment below with the new motto for the Sterling Reyes family.